Very good.
Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with John Wishart, who's going to tell us about his career in the oil industry and how he sees the future of energy. John, good to see you.
Good to see you, Tony. Nice to catch up.
It's great. Now, first of all, as a younger man, what was the attraction of the oil industry in terms of a career?
I think the first was I'm a chemical engineer by background. So the first part was understanding that sort of oil and gas provided or influenced so many of the products we used. And what I was very keen to do is um, was use the knowledge I'd gained during my studies to do, enable the production of these products that was done economically, ethically, uh, in an environmentally sustainable way, and safely. And safely being a very key one because around the time I was graduating, there'd been a number of sort of major incidents, and sort of that had a big impact.
Mm.
So how do we avoid, loss of life? And one of the professors around at the time when I was learning, Professor Lees, it was he coined a phrase, loss prevention, and it kind of covers everything, and it sort of results in maximizing profit. So, making it economically
Yeah,
viable.
yeah. Now, you got in it during a period which I would describe as the golden years, where the oil industry was the place to be, which unfortunately isn't the same situation today. Um, you went to Houston for a couple of weeks, and it turned out to be a bit longer. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I don't know whether it was being in the right place at the wrong time or whatever, but yeah, I was asked to go out. We'd just completed a transaction. The company that we'd started, we sold the company on, and I was asked to go out and help create a carbon copy in Houston. And I probably I probably worked too well while I was out there, but after 2 weeks, they asked me to come back for 3 months. And that kind of led me to them proposing to my now wife, because that was the only way she was going to be able to stay with me. Um, so yeah, it was really interesting. And Houston was, as you say, it was a really interesting time in the energy space. Lots of really interesting technology developments and projects, massive projects in deep water areas. And it was just really exciting. And it sort of allowed me to reinvent myself, and from perhaps being a kind of more, from just being sort of more of a projects troubleshooting type individual, going more into the business. And it gave me the opportunity, through the 10-year period we had there, where I ended up as CEO of a 1.4 billion contracting company involved in really massive projects, some very pertinent to today's, world we live in, but just sort of got a really massive overview and worked very closely with the big operators like Exxon and Conoco and BP and Shell, pushing technology limits and dealing with interestingly, and people don't always see this in America, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in America, had some quite strict requirements. So a lot of work being done with the likes of Exxon and Conoco at refineries to limit emissions. So, that all started in the early noughties, as they say. So, the efforts to reduce emissions have been going on quite a while.
How did the Brits get into the US oil market? I'm thinking particularly of Shell and BP. It wasn't a natural place to be, was it? Presumably they purchased companies, did they?
They did indeed. Yeah, interestingly, so I spent some time with BP, and actually BP was really interesting. Lots of facts about them people probably don't know, but they had a number of divisions. One was a solar, and this is going back to the sort of 80s, they had a solar division. So, if you think now how people can be a little bit critical of oil companies, back then they were all already pursuing solar. They had sort of pet food, they had coal, they had minerals, and obviously oil and gas and shipping. And I think what they discovered was that the value of the company was viewed purely on oil reserves and um, that set the value, and that by selling off mining and coal, which they were able to secure really large sums of money for, and that created the opportunity to then move in. And as you rightly point out, they acquired Ohio, and that opened the door then to America. And I think the other part for the two companies was both were involved. Shell and BP were involved in Nigeria and West Africa and other areas where deep water production was going. And Houston was kind of the home for some of the deep water technology. So there was a natural kind of draw there. And Houston really is the energy center of the world. So from sort of trading and whatever, it's spread now, but certainly at that time it was kind of very critical. So I think that's really how that move
Yeah.
occurred.
Yeah. Yeah, I may be incorrect, so please correct me if I am. But I think BP shares are listed in dollars. You know,
Um, yeah, they were for a while, but
yeah.
think I don't know. I mean, the ones that I still have I think they're on the LSE, but you could be right.
Mm,
Stuff I get quoted in sterling, but
yeah.
Um, a lot of companies did move to the US exchange, and then I think companies moved back to UK, and Shell had moved to the UK as well onto the exchange there.
Yeah, and Shell of course cut off the Dutch connection up to a point, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, a lot of it's, I suppose you'd call it commercial management. It's understanding the different legislative and tax environments you end up in. And I think that has an impact on how companies would kind of operate.
Your travels also took you to Canada. You were at Calgary, which I guess it was the sort of Houston of Canada at the time, and also to
Yeah.
Nova Scotia.
Yeah, another really interesting project. I was doing some interim management in Lasmo, and I was asked to help out on a project called Cohasset Panook, which ended up delivering the first offshore oil and gas in Canada. And again, it was a sort of interesting triangle. The design was being done in Calgary. Obviously, the project was offshore Nova Scotia, so I was based out in Halifax as well. And then we had some major contractors down in Houston. So, but that was really interesting. And again, I think one of the rewarding things was working with a new regulatory body to help them understand. I mean, a lot of the people, I mean, Halifax, there's military, there's obviously fishing.
Yeah.
So a lot of the people involved were sort of had maybe backgrounds that weren't that familiar with oil and gas. And I think one of the key things is trying to help people understand A, the challenges, and B, what you're really trying to do. And I don't think the industry as a whole has perhaps always been that brilliant at sort of doing that. But because it's a sort of it's a big time. I mean, you see today, I mean, there's always headlines about the oil companies, and you kind of see that that's driven a position of, well, let's try and keep our heads down.
Yeah, yeah. You can understand that up to a point. Now,
Yeah,
you're too young to have got involved in the early offshore oil drilling in the North Sea, the Brent lot. But
yeah.
I mean that as a concept was quite a departure from what they've been doing up until now, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's quite interesting. I mean, sort of offshore drilling, again, it started, I think the first sort of, if we want to call it deep water, and at that point, I think it was like 10 meters or 13 meters, was in Louisiana.
Hmm.
Um, And there they sort of plonked, called the sort of mud flats. So they created, these rigs went and just sat on the mud and then they drilled. The technique for drilling, whether it's on land or offshore, is pretty much the same. But I think, like all of these things, this has been one of the things I've really loved about the industry. Each time we sort of move, we go into new areas, and it provides new technology challenges. And the industry was always very quick to kind of respond to those. So, from moving, if you take the moves, the sort of mud flat type rigs that we used. Then they were floated and operated as floating rigs. Then we had the jackups, which allowed us to work in sort of water levels up to sort of 300-400 meters, and
Wow.
then the
Yeah,
semi
that's a
sub.
lot.
Yeah, and I mean now you've got drill ships and semi subs that are working self-positioning, that are working in water depths of 3,000 meters or more, all of which brings huge challenges and a lot of management of risk. And again, I don't think people not maybe intimately involved with the business probably don't realize about the extent of technology development and work done to enable that production. And of course, a lot of that's been driven by the need for energy security, which became really obvious from right back in the sort of 70s with Yom Kippur War, and where OPEC put an embargo, which saw Western oil and gas prices shoot through the roof.
Yeah,
Sort of
yeah,
one of the first big blips we had, and that then kind of drove the need to be working in it's probably more challenging areas. Clearly, working in the Gulf states, shallower waters, more benign conditions, a lot of onshore opportunities. It meant we had to look further and drive further to get the oil and gas, and I think that's been the sort of constant sort of dilemma going forward, is the balance between meeting meeting the production requirements, and that's clearly energy, that the energy needs across the sort of world have continued to grow as populations increased. And there's been that balance of maybe ensuring there's a fair price. And for some of the Gulf states, they're very dependent on their oil income for their economies. And ensuring that the price kind of gets held at a suitable level, if that's
yeah,
the right
yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah. Because we're seeing a situation, aren't we, with the oil, the Gulf states, where they're diversifying quickly into things like tourism and entertainment and everything else. Because presumably, ultimately, they see the writing on the wall. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think it's quite it's quite difficult. I mean, if you look at IEA predictions and OPEC predictions, and other independent analysts, oil and gas, probably people won't like hearing this, but it's got a future for at least another 50 years when you
Mm.
look at all the sort of transition activities that we're looking to achieve. There's still a need for oil and gas, and um, that there's quite possibly going to be some pinch points looking forward, which would seem kind of odd given that the big push on renewables, with offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, the potential carbon capture, all of these things. Because right now there's people are not looking at the profiles, and it's interesting when you put all the profiles together, whilst the reserves may be there, but if you don't start projects soon enough, then those needed profiles don't get met. And so things like Rosebank, that and understandably so, there's a lot of public concern about, global warming, climate, um, that drives into political, and now you see projects like Rosebank in the courts. But there's a bigger holistic thing, and there's potential for price shocks further down the line, which, again, hurts everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
desirable.
I mean, having converted the UK to run on natural gas and to sort of say, well, that's going to have to stop. It's going to cost a fortune, isn't it, to put in replacement heating systems and everything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think the debate around global warming and what needs to happen, I think, has been good in one way, and I think we've got to the point that the Paris agreement and from COP back a few years, I think all of that has been very positive. That the challenge for the world in the broadest sense is, well, just how do you get there? And I think your comment is very valid. It's the infrastructure that's needed
Mm,
to allow us to go there. I mean, quite, and even having come from the oil and gas sector, but one of the critical tasks for speeding up this transition is cleaning up power,
yeah.
and there are a large number of power stations still running on coal. There will be coal-fired power stations still being built and a plan to be built. So that's still happening globally. You need to electrify everything that you possibly can. And then, look at how you clean up the residue. And by the residue, I mean there's those hard to abate areas. So things like, cement works and mining and,
Mm.
shipping, all of these kind of areas. So there's a huge cost to that. And I think all governments are pinched right now, with finance.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're sort of working on the basis, oh, if we say the right thing, it'll be okay. But if,
Yeah.
for example, you take nuclear, the
Yeah.
last Labour government gave up on nuclear completely. And,
Yeah.
they're now finding really that that was a really silly thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, strangely, as part of my degree course, I did a year at the Atomic Energy Authority at Winfrith.
Yeah.
And at that time, UK were probably the global leader, or certainly one of the global leaders. Um, I think I think there had been knee-jerk reactions to things like Fukushima,
Mm,
and what's very interesting, and again, the public don't always have what I call a meaningful debate. There's a lot of emotional debate, which is fine, and I understand that. But Fukushima had a sister reactor power station that was hit by a bigger tsunami, and it carried on running because it had been designed, and it was about a year older, but had had more modern design requirements, and it survived. So it can be made very safe, and nuclear has generally been very safe. But again, you're looking at projects that are going to take 10 to 15 years to
mm.
complete.
That's the
And
problem.
yeah, and require huge amounts of money. And you get back to this situation where governments have to underwrite it's all in good saying, well, private companies need to, invest and whatever. But you can only invest if there's some profitable outcome. And that means that governments will have to underwrite those types of projects. But yeah, I mean, there's still some being built now in Britain, and of course the next, probably the next technology uh, enabler there will be the ability to move to fusion from fission,
Yeah. Well,
i.e.,
that's the complete answer to everything. Only
yeah,
trouble
yeah,
is that I'm told every 20 years it's going to take another 20 years and it never
yeah,
quite materializes. But I mean, that's the ultimate source of energy, isn't it?
yeah, completely. So, I think that's the one that will, as you say, that will provide a very green approach. And it's we need it. I mean, there's plenty of evidence around, and as I say, my background has been oil and gas, but I did a study when my son was still at school, and he was doing something on climate, and we took a look at some ice logs from the Antarctic, and it's really interesting when you look at the timelines and you get to the Industrial Revolution and it kicks up, and then you
Mm.
get to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and it almost goes vertical.
Yeah.
And that coincides, unsurprisingly, with huge population growth, the development of countries. And one of the other, I think, critical factors we're faced with now is that there's a lot of debate about the energy transition and finding green sources. But if you go sort of south, one of the problems that a lot of the islands and countries are facing is more about how can they be resilient.
Mm.
So if you've seen some of the floods in, whether it's sort of Pakistan or other areas, sea levels rising,
Yeah.
which is impacting some small islands. So on top of the whole, all right, what technologies do we use to reduce emissions? You've got another underlying resilience issue, which is how do we fund for these countries to be able to sustain themselves with the changing weather?
Mm.
And you mentioned, again about the move in the Middle East to, tourism and other areas. One of the things is they've been actively working on transition technology and building cities that are powered by solar batteries and whatever. So there's sort of a lot of interesting stuff going on, but it's going to take time and it's going to cost a lot of money. And unfortunately, I think that's the part where, us as the public need to be aware that we're going to see energy prices increase. I mean, it keeps being talked about as free energy, and I'm not entirely comfortable with that statement. I don't think there is such a thing as free energy.
Sounds a bit political to me, John.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's yeah, and it's probably why I try to avoid being involved with politicians.
Okay, but let's get back to oil and chemicals and that sort of thing, because I mean that they are obviously the way we're going to have to put up with it if
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
short term. And anyone that thinks it's all going to change by 2035 or 2050, I'm afraid I don't believe it. But there we are. What about
yeah.
fracking? What are your views on that?
Um, yeah, it's again, there's been a lot of myth. I mean, social media of all sorts of things with gas coming out of taps and all sorts of things. Yeah, it's not right. I do agree that when you do fracking, you're effectively setting off some explosions deeper
Yeah,
into the to break up rock structures to allow the oil and gas to flow so you can kind of accumulate it because you've got what they call tight formations. There was a lot of stuff about the chemicals. Strangely, some of the stuff that's used, the chemicals are all environmentally friendly. They use high pressure chemicals as another way of fracking. And some of those appear in tomato ketchup. So I think if you've got a problem with the fracking, but there is. I mean, I think it's a reasonable concern. There's technology available where that can be monitored, so the concerns about tremors, earthquakes
yeah.
could be better managed. It will increase cost a little bit, but I think that's something that's worth doing because I think giving comfort to residents and population that surround these areas is does make sense, and I think you have to have that right partnership with people in the areas. But it's fracking was being used offshore. Again, interestingly, it's not new technology. It was being used back in the probably the 80s.
Wow.
We were using proppants, they call proppants. We were using them in the North Sea offshore.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think it's a necessary requirement, and it allows you to do, as I say, to maximize potential reserves. And when you look at America, I mean, America were producing a couple of years back up close to around about 13 million barrels a day, which allowed them to not only meet technical or sort of technically they could meet their own requirements but export and make money.
Mm.
Uh, but the element there, and again, it's something that's a bit techy, is refineries need blends of crudes to make them work
Yeah,
because you need sort of different mixtures of or combinations of mixtures of oil, given that it's got a number of different, categories of oil in amongst them. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's kind of needed. Um, but I think the push has to be on renewables. But I think there needs to be the understanding that there will need to be oil and gas, and heat pumps. I think that's a great technology. But I mean, I live in an old Victorian house, and I know in the old parts of our house, which are the original Victorian bits, it's difficult to insulate.
yeah,
Uh,
that's right. Solid walls, presumably, and
exactly.
mm,
So, the heat pumps aren't as efficient. In the newer part of our house or extension, it stays warm. Even if you turn all the radiators off, it still stays warm because the insulation is so much better.
yeah, yeah,
So there's so much more we can do. And again, it's one of the things that hasn't really been spoken about, interestingly, which is if there's a lot of talk about CO2, reducing CO2 emissions, and if you look back and you start sort of around the 60s, if we'd done nothing, the total kind of emissions today would be up at around 79 gigatons of CO2.
yeah.
But we're actually at about 34, 35.
Right.
So there's actually been a significant reduction, and that's with, the increasing demands. So there's a hell of a lot of work being done, an automotive area where fuels are more efficient.
Mm, yeah,
Uh, and people, using renewables. But it's a journey, and I think that's the kind of thing people have got to understand now. It's the transition is a journey. It's not an event, and it's not a switch. You can't just turn oil off and
yeah.
switch on renewables.
The next day.
Yeah.
The South Atlantic. I mean, many people thought that part of the reason for the Falklands War, apart from the obvious, was to try and safeguard Britain's position in the South Atlantic because there are areas that had been allocated. Have they done much drilling down there, or?
Yeah, there's there's work ongoing at the moment. But it proves to be and continues to prove to be. I mean, there is a political sensitivity. Um, you would probably be wanting to use ports in Argentina, as supply bases and
Yeah,
whatever, rather than a sort of small island.
yeah,
Um, and that's obviously that's not possible just now. So it's quite expensive, and I mean, there's been projects, and I know they're sort of nudging closer to sort of getting potential approval. But again, now against the backdrop of the transition and reducing emissions, when you start to look at the project, you start to think, well, how is it really a practical step?
yeah. I mean, I don't think at the moment you'd want to do any deals with Argentina based on the Chagos situation.
Yeah, I
You know,
mean,
I
I
think their
agree.
price would be the Falklands.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the challenge. And um, I do think as a country with energy security,
Hmm.
we have the potential reserves. And when you look at Norway, okay, I appreciate it's a smaller population, but I think they have done a much better job creating a sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
Um,
They didn't spend it.
well, yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
exactly.
my old
And
age pension is probably coming out of North Sea oil money, whereas, it really should have been invested into the future, shouldn't it?
exactly, I mean, Norway owns big chunks of London real estate,
Yeah.
and it's kind of interesting, but they've had a very sort of pragmatic, socialistic in the broader sense of the word, approach to how they manage that. They're still doing oil and gas developments. They're pushing hard with renewables, and they went off to America to try and push hard there, and they're doing stuff with floating offshore wind. So, I think it's how you go about things, and it's not so much being critical of what various governments have done, but I think UK has been way too
Hmm.
short-termism. Everything's been based on a sort of 4 to 5 year horizon, which maybe we can achieve, very political.
Yeah.
Whereas there needs to be a coming together of all the parties and just
Sort of agree a long-term plan. Simple as that, isn't it?
it is, and interestingly, I was spent some time in China working with the sort of Chinese, and that's what they have now. Okay, they that they have the ability of just plowing on and doing what they want, and they don't really do a lot of consultation with their people, but they have got long-term plans, and those
Mm.
start at the top and go right down through their organizations. And they're moving rapidly with wind, um, probably moving now way quicker than Europe. So it can be done, but it needs that collective
Yeah.
will, and it needs
Yeah.
everybody pulling in the right
Yeah.
direction.
All the politicians sign up to a 20-year plan and agree that whoever's in power won't go and wreck it.
Yeah, exactly. It's that to me is one of the the worrying aspects of our political system, and I think there's a lot of valid views. I also worry. I found this quite staggering. I think in the civil service, when you look at the modern world and how important technology and science is, and all the science and technology based industries. I think it's less than 10% of the civil service is qualified, is
Mm.
science-based
Yeah.
qualification,
Yeah.
but maybe a better way of putting it. And that I find a bit worrying.
Yes, it certainly is, I think, in not just energy, but there we are. Now, of
Yeah.
course, the dynamic changed a couple of weeks ago with the election of President Trump.
Yeah. And I think he he probably drives everybody mad. But in amongst all his various statements, he's quite clear, and he views it more like running a business.
Mm.
Um, and he made a very interesting statement, which it was in relation to I'm trying to think which one of the appointments it was, but he said, "I've allowed X to go off and
Yeah.
do whatever he wants,
Yeah.
but I've told him to leave the oil and gas alone. That's what I'm going to use. And that is our golden ticket.
Yeah.
That is what will pay for growth, allow us to pay down debt." And he's figured that bit out. And I suspect he will upset probably politicians around the world, because I suspect he's going to, um, I say renege, but
Talk.
cancel their involvement in
Yeah.
COP and other
Talking
things.
about tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, he's very much a protectionist type individual, and you want to do business here, well, you're going to pay tax, and
Mm.
I've got oil and gas. I don't need the rest of the world, and we're going to use that to pay down the debts we've got. It's to be seen how that all plays out. I mean, he's got a 4 year term, and it's quite a short period of time, and
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I don't know, but I think he's going to have quite an impact. But I'm not sure it's all negative. I mean, one of the big challenges for business right now is the geopolitical situation around the world, and he's perhaps one of the sort of individuals that brings a sort of maybe more of a pragmatic approach to it. Okay, you can argue whether it's right, wrong, or otherwise,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
trying to get a peace deal in Ukraine, which brings more stability there, trying to resolve the issue in the Gulf at the moment, particularly with sort of Lebanon and um,
And of course, trying to get the Chagos Treaty cancelled.
yeah, I mean that as I say, I'm not a politician and
No,
I
no,
don't
no,
really understand it that
no.
well. But yeah, I find these kind of things.
Yeah, it's in a strategic spot. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and
He
looking.
his main advantage, John, is that he's got a majority in the Senate and in the Congress itself. So,
Yeah, yeah,
that puts you in a far stronger position than a lot of American presidents have in the past because, of course, they've been stymied by the legislature.
exactly. But interestingly, I mean, Labour have that kind of opportunity right now, in that they've secured what would be considered a strong mandate. The Conservative Party had a similar mandate years ago,
Mm.
but they Conservatives got too hung up in internal fighting and never managed to achieve anything.
Yeah,
And I sort of probably have some slight concerns that the same could happen. You know, whether you like it or not, but it's an opportunity for some cohesive and coherent thinking and
yeah,
driving change.
yeah. And as you
And
say, think of it for the sake of the country, not the party.
yeah, precisely. And that's always been my view. That's
Mm.
what politicians should be
Yeah,
doing. It's best for the country,
yeah.
not what's best from a party political point of view.
Mm. John, we've just about run out of time. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Really enjoyed our chat this morning, and we'll be publishing this show on Friday. So there we are. Anyway,
Okay.
many many thanks, and
You're very welcome.
hope you'll look us up next time you're over.
For sure. I always love being in Alderney.
That's great. Cheers, mate.
I look forward to catching you up, Tony.
Yeah.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.